Appreciate you being here. We're in John 9. If you would, go ahead and open up to John chapter 9. And I'd like to make a couple of preliminary remarks about the structure of the book of John. The entire thing forces us to see the identity of Christ. And so in John chapter 1, John, a very strategic writer, even of his own merit, writes to us that we ought to come and see exactly who this Jesus is. John chapter 1 and verse 46. Now I know that that's in the lips of one of the others, but this is John's writing to let us know that what we're doing when we open the text of John is we're seeing who the Christ is, who Jesus really is. And so then in chapter 1 and verse 41, it even says that the word Christ, it's a Greek word, Christos, is literally a translation from a Hebrew Messiah. And so when we talk about the Christ or we talk about the Messiah, we're talking about an office of a character that had long been anticipated by the Old Testament people. They were looking forward to the last heir of David's line. And you've got passages all over the New Testament, Luke 1, 31 through 33, Acts 15, 14 and following, Acts 1, 3 through 8, where it insists that the person of Jesus was the last of the line of David. And he was declared to be such, Romans 1 and verse 4 says, through the resurrection by God's power. And so when we open up John's text, we're finding out who is this Jesus of Nazareth. And what the book does then is it divides itself. The professionals tell us all of this. They tell us that the book neatly divides itself. And if you'll look at the text of John maybe later and look at this, you'll see that they're right. 1 through 12:37 is the first unit of the book of John. It's divided into two. And 1 through 12:37 is titled the Book of Signs. And you've got 7 major miracles, 7 total miracles in the gospel according to John, in which we start to find out that this Jesus Christ, this boy from Nazareth, was not merely just another character, not just another prophet, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on, but we're going to find out that what Jesus is saying is that he's one who can do things that surpass even that of the older prophets before. He's more than just a prophet. And so then the second part of the book of John might be titled something like the Book of the Passion, where we find out in John chapter 12 and verse 38, that runs through John chapter 21 and verse 25, we find out that what that text is telling us is that Christ is not only the Messiah, but he's also this individual who would suffer and die vicariously for the whole world. And we'll talk about that, of course, more in about the middle of the lesson. With that being said, we're examining today John chapter 9, 1 through 41, and it is the 6th of 7 of those signs in the gospel according to John. If you would, go ahead and open up to chapter 9 and verse 1 if you're not already there, and I'll tell you how we're going to approach the lesson. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to examine the text. We're simply just going to read, really, 1 through 41. I know that's a longer reading. I'll read quickly. You're already finding out that I speak quickly. The second thing we'll do is we'll explain some of the theological content that's found therein, just 2 major points that I really want to zone in on and look at as Christ being the Messiah and how that's played out through the episode of John chapter 9. And then the third thing that we'll do is we'll draw some application out of all this, and we'll expose exactly what the narrative is trying to teach us. So Jesus did heal this blind man and make him see again. Well, what does that mean for us? Take a look at this. This is John 9:1, and we'll read through verse 7. It says, "And as Jesus passed by, he saw a man which was blind from his birth. And his disciples asked him, saying, Master, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And in verse 3 it says, Jesus answered, Neither hath this man sinned, nor his parents, but that the works of God should be made manifest in him." Verse 4. And then it says, "I must work the works of him that sent me while it is day. The night cometh when no man can work. As long as I'm in the world, I am the light of the world," Jesus said. Verse 6. "And when he had thus spoken, he spat on the ground, and he made clay of the spittle, and he anointed the eyes of the blind man with the clay, and said unto him, Go wash in the pool of Siloam, which is, by interpretation, meaning sent." And maybe there's even an echo there to the Old Testament. You'll pursue that in your own time. Verse 7. "He went his way therefore, and washed, and came seeing." Now the first thing that we're starting to find out in 1 through 7 is the healing of this blind man. But the episode that unfolds follows in verses 8 through 12, where some of the others have a discourse with the Christ. So he did heal this man. Now here's an exchange with the blind man, and Christ is going to become involved in some of this. Look at this in verses 8 through 12. It says this, "The neighbors therefore, and they which had before seen him that he was blind, said, Is not this he that sat and begged? And some said, This is he. Others said, He is like him. But he then said," his own testimony was, "I am he." Verse 10, "Therefore said they unto him, How were thine eyes opened? And he answered and said, A man that is called Jesus made clay, and anointed my eyes, and said unto me, Go to the pool of Siloam and wash. And I went and washed, and I received sight. And then said they unto him, Where is he? And he said, I don't know. I'm not keeping track of this fellow. But then in verses 13 through 38 rather, we see the unfolding narrative say there's this healing issue, but now the Pharisees can't just simply go along with it and say, oh, Christ is who he claims to be, can they? They've got to do something with his claim. And so it's time for them to get involved and try to reduce the force of all that's been done. And so in verse 13 it says this, They brought to the Pharisees him that aforetime was blind, and it was the Sabbath day when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. And then again the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. And he said unto them, He put clay upon my eyes, and I washed, and now I see. Verse 16, Therefore said some of the Pharisees, This man is not of God, because he keeps not the Sabbath day. Others said, How can a man that's a sinner, though? How can he do such miracles? And then there was a division among them, not unlike Acts chapter 23, where Paul sees the same kind of thing unfolding with the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Verse 17, John 9:17. They say again to the blind man, What sayest thou of him, that he hath opened thine eyes? And he said, He is a prophet. But the Jews did not believe concerning him that he had been blind and received his sight until they had called the parents of him that had received his sight. They said, Get his mom and dad over here. Verse 19, And so they asked them, saying, Is this your son? Really, is this your son, who you say was born blind? How then does he now see? And his parents said, We know that this is our son, and that he was born blind. But by what means he now sees, we don't know. Or who hath opened his eyes, we know not. He is of age, ask him. He shall speak for himself. Verse 22. These words spake his parents because they feared the Jews. For the Jews had agreed already that if any man did confess that he was Christ, he would be put out of the synagogue. 23. Therefore said his parents, He is of age, ask him. And then again they called the man that was blind, said unto him, Give God the praise. Look, forget about this Jesus fellow. Let's just say God did it. We know that this man, after all, Jesus, is a sinner. Verse 25. He answered and said, Whether he be a sinner or not, I know not. One thing I know, that is, whereas I was blind, I now see. And then in verse 26, they said to him again, Well, what did he do to thee? How did he open your eyes? It seems like we've read this before, haven't we? This is 27. He answered them, I have told you already, and you did not hear. Wherefore would you hear it again? Will you also be his disciples? And then they reviled him and said, You're his disciple, but we are Moses' disciples. Verse 29. We know that God spake unto Moses, As for this fellow, we know not from whence he is. And the man answered and said unto them, Why, herein is a marvelous thing, that you know not from whence he is, and yet he's the one that's opened my eyes. And then in verse 31, the blind man, I think that's important. I might make a remark about that later, but I think it's important we recognize this isn't Jesus speaking at this point. It says, The blind man said, Now we know that God heareth not sinners, but if any man be a worshipper of God, and doeth his will, him he heareth. Verse 32, Since the world began, was it not heard that any man opened the eyes of one that was born blind? And that's true. The closest you've got is 2 Kings 6, and even that's not a person born blind. That's Elisha working some kind of miracle. So he's got it right on that. Verse 33, If this man were not of God, he could do nothing. And in verse 34, they answered and said unto him, and watch this, this is what they charge him with. You were altogether born in sin, and you're now going to be the one to teach us? And at that they cast him out. Verse 35, Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and when he had found him, he said unto him, Do you believe on the Son of God? And he answered and said, Who is he, Lord, that I might believe on him? And Jesus said unto him, Thou hast both seen him, and it is he that talketh with thee. And in verse 38 he said, Lord, I believe, and he worshipped him. Now verse 39, we have the final little episode of this whole event. And it says in 39 through 41, Jesus said, For judgment I am come into this world, that they which see might not see, and that they which see might be made blind. And some of the Pharisees which were with him heard these words, and said unto him, Are we blind also? And Jesus said unto them, If you were blind, you should have no sin. But now you say, We see, therefore your sin remaineth. The reason I'm reading all of this with you, you'll pardon me for that. The reason I'm reading it all with you is because there's just too much here, and if this were a Bible class or something, if we were in class, I'd go verse by verse and do something different, but we're not in that kind of setting. So let me call attention to a couple of things. This is strikingly similar to a former episode in John chapter 5. In both cases, you've got the pools. In 5, it's the pool of Bethesda. In 9, it's the pool of Siloam. In chapter 5, you've got a mention of it was on the Sabbath day. And you've got the same reference here in chapter 9 and verse 16. And then you've got this difficult circumstance. Both of these characters have been since birth, or it's an unusual circumstance. This isn't like some kind of sickness that popped up overnight. No, this is something that was of long standing. This man, it says in 9:1, had been born blind. And there was never before, even in the Old Testament, there was never an episode where a man that was born with such a condition was healed this way. Like I mentioned, 2 Kings 6 is the closest you've gotten. Those people were not born blind, but stricken blind by Elisha. And then the last thing that's really similar here in 5, also to 9, is that these are unconventional healings. In the one case, in 5, he says, take up your bed, it's time to walk. In 9, he says, let me take the clay and I'll put it on your eyes and you're going to see. And so there's some kind of unconventional healing. The purpose of all of this, what John is doing, is once again calling our attention to a former episode, John chapter 5, and he's saying again, he's reinforcing what he's already said, and that is that this man, Jesus of Nazareth, this boy, only maybe 30 to 33 years old, I'm thinking, this boy is our Savior. And he's doing extraordinary things. These are things that you can't just reduce to nothing. And that's what the Pharisees are trying to do. We'll have none of it. That's what John's getting at. And then you notice the progression by the Pharisees. If you look at the text, I've got a list here you can see of all of these verses and how they progress. But they've got to do something with the miracle. They've got to reduce the claim somehow. You don't just get to walk away and say it never happened. And that's what the Pharisees are now being forced to reckon with. And so in John chapter 9, verses 13 through 15, the first thing they start by doing is they say, well, let's make inquiry. Let's ask what's going on. And then in verse 16, after that doesn't really take, they get some kind of a good explanation from the blind man. In John chapter 9 and verse 16, they say, well, I know what we can do now. Let's accuse him of violating Sabbath. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on. But then they go to this new extreme. In verses 18 through 23, they say, well, let's deny that he was ever even blind. But that's not going to take too well, is it? They call the parents in. The parents recognize him. And just like we recognize people by their faces, by their accents, by their characteristics, their mannerisms, so it is in John chapter 9. The parents say, this is our son. Now, we don't know how it is that he's seeing anymore. We don't know anything about that. But what we do know is this, and that is that he was blind, and now he sees. Now, that's a very forceful claim. If you take the text as unreliable, I've got information for you you'll talk to me about later to show that the text is reliable. But if the text is reliable, and I'm telling you it is, then I'm telling you this as well. The miracle proves Jesus to be the Christ, the Son of the living God. That's his claim. And the miracle validates the claim. And that's what's going on consistently in the 7 signs of the text of John's Gospel. Now, then here's where they go with it again. In verses 26 and 27, in 24 and 25, don't they? They say, we ought to just praise God. Let's forget about Jesus. Let's just unify on the one thing we can get on board with, and that's that we both believe in God. Well, that's not going to take. And the man says in verses 24 and 25, he says, go on in verse 27, he says, hey, how about you actually convert to be his disciples? Oh, and that's a claim they couldn't have stomached, of course. But then in 26 and 27, they ask him again. Well, tell us one more time. He says, I've already told you. And then in 28 through 34, they say, well, whatever we make of any of this, let's just say this. We know we follow Moses, and that ought to just settle the matter. That's not going to settle the matter. Jesus Christ is saying he came to be a successor of Moses. And so, no, we're not just going to get away with this by saying, well, we all agree that we're Moses' disciples. That's not going to be enough. And so then if you look at the Pharisees and their progression and how worse it gets as the episode goes on, I think we need to contrast that against the progression of the blind man. He starts out in 9:17, doesn't he, by saying something like this, he's a prophet, 9:17. You know, I think that the Pharisees probably could have gotten on board maybe somewhere around that time. After all, some of the Old Testament prophets had their mistakes, didn't they? I think maybe the Pharisees could have said, we'll go for that. We'll settle for that. But it didn't stop there. As they progress, even to deny that Jesus Christ was a prophet, the blind man progresses, and he says, it's time for me to defend Jesus. Look at 9:25 again. He says, I don't really know whether or not this man's a sinner, but I can tell you this. I was blind, I now see. Figure that out. And that's what he's getting these Pharisees to start reckoning with. And then 9:27, he invites them into his discipleship, into Jesus' discipleship. It doesn't end with him just simply saying, I guess we can agree to disagree. No, in 9:27, he says, would you hear it again? And he says, if I told you it again and again and again, what's happened, you know this validates him to be the Son of God. And then he closes with 9:27, how about after all you become his disciples? Oh, you know that didn't sit well with them. And then in 9:34, look at this, 9:34, they took it. It doesn't say that he was correcting them. But in 9:34, that's what they accuse him of doing. And they say, you were the one born in sin, and now you're the one teaching us? Oh, they couldn't stomach that. But then even crazier is this, in 9:38, the man who starts out in the text as being labeled just as a prophet, and then maybe he gets a little bit of a defense from the blind man, and then the blind man tells them, oh, come be his disciples. The narrative cuts by saying this in 9:38. It says that he called him Lord, the Son of God, and worshiped him. Maybe the blind man, after all, was convinced. How would you take it if somebody came and healed something of an infirmity that you've been dealing with since birth? I think we'd have to take it and say, there's something extraordinary about this man. And that's what the 6th sign of the book of John, along with the other 6, that's what it's doing. It's telling us who Jesus is. Now, I think there's something to be made here, and I might come back to this a little bit later on in the lesson, and that is that the language of light and dark, blind and being able to see, there's something here. And in the text in chapter 8, verses 4 and 5, I'll call your attention to this once more. It says, I must work the works of him that sent me while it is day. The night comes when no man can work. And Christ says, as long as I'm in the world, I'm the light of the world. And he's reverberating what had been said formerly in chapter 8 and verse 12, right? Of course he is. He's letting them once again know that there's a major theme in John's gospel, that he is the light in a dark and dying world. So much so that in John chapter 1, verses 6 through 8, John comes into the world and he says, I'm not the light. I'm not the light at all. But in 5:35, he tells us this. He says, but I am the lampstand that gives testimony to the light. And if we're reading anything out of John's gospel, we're to find out that our role is not unlike that of John's, as we're to be the candlestick or the candle stand that lifts up the light and bears testimony about it to the dark and dying world. I think there's an aspect here, and more than one person has said that the heart of biblical theology, the heart of all of the Bible, is this, and there is a dual theme of judgment upon the wicked and redemption to those that need it. And I think that's really good. I think as we see, especially in the Old Testament prophets, and then even into the book of Acts, and especially in Christ's Olivet Discourse, and also then in the book of Revelation, we see that there's this dual theme where God judges the wicked and redeems the righteous. And that ultimately is a theme that we're holding out for. Okay, let's talk about some of the theological content then in John chapter 9. This whole episode, if we were to give it a singular strand, and we've kind of done that by giving the lesson a title, right? It's the healing of a blind man. If we were to just summarize the whole chapter of John 9, what is it talking about? It's the healing of the blind man. Now this is very interesting because this is forcing our attention back into some Old Testament texts. Now, I don't have time to read all of them with you, but I want to call your attention, at least for the moment, to Isaiah 35:5. This is Isaiah chapter 35 and verse 5. And the idea of being able to see, the idea of being blinded or being darkened, is a major theme in Isaiah's text. But this is Isaiah chapter 35 and verse 5, and you'll stomach my assertion that this is talking about the Messiah's kingdom. Now, I don't think it's a predictive thing. Wrangle with this for a moment. I don't think it's a prediction of the Messiah's kingdom. I think it's a prophecy of the Messiah's kingdom. If you think that there's a big to-do over what I've just said, talk to me afterwards. This is Isaiah 35:5. It says, then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf shall be unstopped. Okay, the point that the prophet's drawing out is a day is coming. The Messiah is going to break forth. And as the prophet Isaiah imagines all of this, the blind folks are going to see now. And then there are these other texts where it says in Isaiah chapter, 56, he says the lame people are going to walk. And then it even says in Isaiah 56, imagining the Messiah's era as well, it says there's a day coming where even the castrated folks, the eunuchs, the Gentiles will all be partaking in Messiah's reign as well. Now, one of the interesting things is that in Isaiah 35, he's saying the blind people in the Messiah's era will see. I don't think that Isaiah is predicting John 9, and you don't either. But what Isaiah is doing is he's imagining a kind of day where the Messiah breaks forth, and all of the things that we would expect the Messiah to offer are coming to fruition in the person Jesus of Nazareth. And so we have these other texts. Look at this. This is Isaiah 42. This is Isaiah chapter 42 and verse 7. And I'll tell you something about the unit of Isaiah here in just a second. But this is Isaiah 42:7. We'll read it first. In Isaiah 42:7, it says that the servant was going to come forth, and he was going to open the blind eyes, bring out the prisoners from the prison, and them that sit in the darkness out of the prison house. He's going to offer freedom. He's going to offer light. These people are going to be able to see. None of this is talking physically, I'm persuaded. But what the prophet is doing is he's using language to which they can relate to say a better day is ahead. A better day is coming. That day is coming in the Messiah. Now, in Isaiah chapters 1 through 66, the book neatly divides itself into at least two major sections, 1 through 39 and 40 through 66. And you're going to have to really follow me here. This is getting thorny. In Isaiah 40 through 55, you have four texts that are titled the Servant Songs. 42, Isaiah 42, Isaiah 49, Isaiah 50, and Isaiah, of course, 53. Now, those 4 texts speak about this servant character. And the servant character has a task that's laid at his feet, and he's supposed to do wonderful things. But look at how it starts. I've got a chart here that I want to show you. This is Israel, the nation. And if you're in 41 of Isaiah, turn over to Isaiah 41 and look at this in 8 and 9. Speaking about the nation, he says in 41, 8 and 9, "But you, Israel, are my servant, Jacob, whom I have chosen, the seed of Abraham, my friend." And then again in 9b, 41, 9b, it says to the nation again, "You are my servant, I have chosen thee." And something like that is said in Deuteronomy chapter 7, isn't it? Where God had determined that Israel was going to be a light and a token to the nations, the Gentiles, the heathen. And the nation is declared in 41, 8 and 9 to be the servant. Now this is very interesting because in 42, the task is laid at the nation's feet. And you know what ends up happening? So says 49:4. So says Isaiah 49:4. Catch this. The servant failed the task. Anybody who says all of the servant songs only and exclusively speak of Christ, I've got 100 questions for you. One of them would be this, and that is in 49:4, how did the servant fail the task? Now that's what the text says. Now look at this in 49. I think what happens, and I've got a bunch of sources that would agree with me, not that that matters, but I think that this handles the text in the Old Testament context well, and I think it's going to make the New Testament, as it uses it, really glow. Look at this in 49. I think that the nation, since they couldn't fulfill the task, it gets more specific. As God says, well, the nation's not suited. In fact, what was it Paul said in Romans 11:3? He said it this way. He said, aren't there 7,000 who haven't bowed their knee to Baal? Well, why not millions? It seems to me that there would have been millions in Israel at this time. Why would he not go ahead and say all of Israel? Because there were people in Israel. There were people in Israel who were not living righteously. They couldn't meet this task that God had laid at their feet. And so God says, I've got to find something else. But he doesn't remove the task from the nation of Israel. He redefines. He gets more specific, and he says, I'll give it to the remnant. The righteous remnant will fulfill this task. But in 49, even they bomb. And you know what ends up happening? As the righteous remnant even is not suited for one major task, which is vicarious suffering for the world, even the most righteous men in Israel had sinned. There had to be one man who would stand up out of the nation, and that is the Messiah, spoken of in Isaiah 52 and 53. And what ends up happening is Isaiah is saying the task of the servant, the task of the Messiah, would be to extend light, vision, even to those who are living in darkness and cannot see. But then there's something else that happens very interesting. Very interesting. This is Isaiah 54. Look at this in Isaiah 54. In Isaiah 54, coming right off the heels, of course, of Isaiah 53, look at what gets stated in Isaiah 54. It says in verse 17, no weapon that's formed against thee shall prosper, every tongue that shall rise against thee in judgment thou shalt condemn. But then instead of being a singular servant, which happens in 52 and 53, we're back to the plural. And it says it this way in 54:17. This is the heritage of the servants of the Lord. Multiple servants. Look at this in 56. This is 56. What verse is it here? Verse 6. And of the sons of the stranger, talking about when the Messiah comes, the sons of the stranger, the Gentile, that join themselves to the Lord to serve him and to love the name of the Lord, they'll be his servants. Plural again. Now here's what's happening. The nation failed. God redirects. He says, well, the remnant will do it. The remnant fails. They can't meet the task of vicarious suffering. And so God says the nation, as embodied in a singular individual, the Messiah, will bring forth redemption for the world. And at the cross, what ends up happening is this gets expanded, and God says the task that had once been given to Israel, now through the Christ, has been expanded to people on the other side of the cross like you and me. And we, as the servants of the Lord, are to partake and to participate in the mission and the message of Jesus Christ. Now this gets really interesting. I'll make one more point and get off of it. This is Isaiah 61. Isaiah 61, I want to turn over there and look at this, and then we'll get back into John 9. I promise you this makes sense here in a second. In Isaiah chapter 61, 1 and 2, look at this in your Old Testament. Do you see anything about extending vision to the blind folks? Give it a look there for just a second. 61, 1 and 2. Spirit of the Lord's upon me. He's anointed me to preach good tidings to the meek. He sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, proclaiming liberty to the captives, the opening of the prison to them that are bound, proclaiming the acceptable year of the Lord and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all them that mourn. Anything about extending sight to the blind? Not in my Old Testament. But if you check the Septuagint, this gets interesting, because Isaiah 61, 1 and 2 in the LXX, in the Septuagint, has this strand of text that says, oh, by the way, the Spirit of the Lord, the one who's anointed by that, He's also going to extend vision to those that are blind. I need to call your attention to Luke 4. Luke 4. Look at this in Luke 4. It's the reason that we know, it's because Jesus is quoting the text in Luke 4 that we know He's using the Septuagint. And in Luke chapter 4, beginning in verse 17, He gets to the synagogue, the scroll is there, He pulls the scroll, and it says in the text of Luke 4, He starts scanning through this text to find the scripture where it's located, and He finds Isaiah 61 in the LXX, in the Greek Old Testament. And in that strand of text, if you're in 18, Luke 4:18, it says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He's anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives. And then you have this in 18, and the recovering of the sight to the blind. What ends up happening is passages like Isaiah 35:5, Isaiah 42:7, Isaiah 61, all get conflated and shoved together into one text, and it says the Messiah has come. And Jesus says this in Luke 4, all of that era that we were expecting has come in me. And then it makes me think about the Messiah's reign, and it makes us think about our task then. If the nation's task was to bear light to the world, a dark and dying world, and Jesus comes onto the scene and says He did it, fulfilling Isaiah's mission, it makes me wonder where my place is in all of this. It's right there with Christ, to take light to the world. Now catch this. This is also something else that happens. This is John chapter 9, verse 4. And it says that the time while Jesus was on earth was considered, in the text, it was considered day. The time was considered to be day. And in John chapter 12, if you turn over, this is just as this section, this major unit is being brought to a close. Just as John 12 is closing the book of signs, in John 12:34 and 35, it says, the people answered Him, we've heard out of the law that Christ, Messiah, abides forever. He won't die. And how do you say then this, the Son of Man must be lifted up? Specifically on the cross, I think. Who is this Son of Man? And then in verse 35, Jesus responds to give an answer to their question. Well, a little while is the light with you. He's going to leave. Walk while you have the light, lest darkness come upon you. For he that walks in darkness knows not whither he goes. And the point that Jesus is making is this. The light is going to leave. Messiah is going to ascend to heaven. And then the people are going to be asking, where is Messiah now? And the point that Jesus is leaving behind for those of us who attempt to be His disciples is this. Christ's light is left behind in us, folks. Christ's light is left behind in us. If Christ is not personally among us, spreading light to the dark and dying world, it makes us wonder, whose task is that? Whose task is it now to take up the noble task of being the servant of the Lord? It's ours, folks. It's ours. Let's draw some applications and bring all of this to a close. The first thing is this. There is a major difference between suffering and punishment. Now, it could be the case, it can be the case sometimes, that punishment comes in the form of suffering. But just because somebody's suffering doesn't mean that God's punishing them. In fact, we have something like that in the book of Job, isn't it? But make no mistake about it, catch this. This is Job 42:11. It says, and the narrator says in every unit of the book of Job, the narrator consistently says that God was the one causing Job to suffer. Do you catch that? Sometimes it might be the case, like Paul with the thorn in the flesh, that we suffer. And God's the one actually allowing it. Maybe He's even behind it. But that doesn't mean He's punishing us. In the text of Ezekiel, in Ezekiel chapter 9 and verse 4, in the vision, God takes these men and gives them a seal, which is largely prefiguring what goes on in Revelation 7. But in Ezekiel chapter 9 and verse 4, God says, take this stamp, and you're going to seal the foreheads and the wrists of all of the men who will not be destroyed in the upcoming judgment of 586 BC with the destruction of the temple. And these men in the vision are sealed. They're the righteous folks. They get this stamp. But then interestingly enough, in Ezekiel chapter 21 and verse 4, it says that the righteous ones, I'm presuming the same ones that are sealed, are going to be slain by the sword and by pestilence and by famine. And it makes me wonder, how can God stamp these people out and say, well, these are my protected people, as then here they are getting killed by the sword? He'd just given us a vision. Is he contradicting himself? Certainly not. Here's the point, folks. Those people that were righteous in Ezekiel's day, they were certainly suffering. They weren't being punished. And from our limited perspective, sometimes we see things that happen to us or neighbors or colleagues, and we feel that, and we say, that's not right. Something's wrong there. No, folks, something might be right. And what God might be doing is He might be expecting us to realize that there's a difference between suffering and punishment, and we've then been given a task to bear the suffering in a very noble and honorable way. And this leads to a second point of application, and that is this: God uses infirmity to His glory. Look at this in Ephesians 3. I need to turn over to Ephesians 3. It said in John 9, didn't it? John chapter 9 and verse 1, this man was born blind. Let's not make the mistake of saying, well, he wasn't suffering. He certainly was. Was he being punished? Everything in the text says otherwise. Look at this in Ephesians chapter 3, and then we'll come back to John 9 here in just a second. In Ephesians chapter 3, Paul is writing from a cell, a prison, and he's going to tell us that in 3:13. In fact, so much so that he says this: I desire that you do not weary, you do not faint at my tribulations for you. But instead, he says, my tribulations are for your glory. And the point that's being made, and Paul does the same kind of thing with the thorn in the flesh, he's saying this is an opportunity. This is a moment where we can use the crisis and demonstrate God's glory to the world in it. And that's what he's getting at in John 9:3. I'm still in John 9:3, so I'll read it to you. But if you're not in John 9:3, you might want to turn over. I don't know. It's just going to be a second. This is 9:3 of John. It says regarding the blind man, who sinned, his parents or him? And then in 9:3 it says, no. The works of God should be made manifest in him. When people see you going through the health crises that you face, they see you experiencing loss, they see you grieving, they see you sorrowful, don't let it be said of you, well, I wonder what sin he did. Let it be said of you this. Let it be said this. No, he's glorifying God on this behalf. I thought I read a passage somewhere where it said, if any man suffer, let him do it as a Christian and let him glorify God on this behalf. And folks, that's a motivation for us, that if we are suffering, there's a difference between punishment and that. And God's telling us to push on, glorify Him, and use it as an opportunity. What do you think about this? What do you think about this? If God had come to Paul and said, Paul, now you've asked me 3 times, not unlike Moses in Deuteronomy 3, let me go into the promised land. And God said, don't ask me again. He tells Paul the same thing. Not unlike Matthew 26. You know all of these passages, right? I'm spitting a lot out. You know all of this. This is Matthew 26. The Lord says, let this cup pass from me. 3 times, the Lord says no. Not unlike that, Paul says in 2 Corinthians 12, he says, take the thorn, take the thorn. But what if God had come to Paul and said, Paul, I could take the thorn from you, or we could leave it and let's see what happens. And I'll tell you this up front, 5,000 will convert to the gospel because of it. Knowing Paul's character, what do you think Paul would have taken? Knowing Paul's character, you know he would have said, God, I'll take the thorn. Folks, whatever you do with your lives, take the thorn and use it to the glory of God. Number 3, our desire to honor the law can go too far. In John chapter 9 and verse 16, these individuals come and they say, it's on the Sabbath day. He's violating the law. Look, folks, whatever we do with the law, let's not forget our neighbor. Let's not forget our loving of God in the process. Now, there are things, 1 Corinthians 1 says something about this. It says in 1:5 of 1 Corinthians, it says that they were enriched in speech and knowledge. It says in chapter 1 and verses 10 through 12 that they had even gotten to where they started abusing the name of Jesus Christ Himself. And then in chapter 1 and verse 17, it says they even abused the token of baptism. Sure, it's all of these things are good. Speech is good. Knowledge is good. The name of Jesus is certainly good. Baptism is obviously good. All of these things are good. But Paul says this to them. He says, but you're still somehow stirring up division. And that makes me think that sometimes even in honoring the law and wanting to be zealous for God, we can take the law too far. And that's what these people were doing. They were taking the Sabbath and they were saying, we've got to keep Sabbath, we've got to keep Sabbath. All the while they're abusing their neighbor and not loving God. We'll have none of that. We'll have none of that. Folks, tell me about baptism. Tell me about Christ. Tell me about the church. Tell me about all of that. But don't do it until you love God first. We'll hear none of that until we find out that you've got a relationship with God. Don't you weary of people who preach baptism hard and they beat up our denominational friends with it, all the while having no relationship with God? Don't you weary of this? I certainly do. I certainly do. I thought I read somewhere in Mark chapter 2, wasn't it? Mark 2, 27 and 28. It says that the law, the Sabbath law, was created for man and not man for the Sabbath. So let's not abuse the man who says, I'm staying home because of the wintry snow this winter. And we say, well, he's forsaking the assembly. Tell me about going to church, but don't do it while we beat our neighbors up. Tell me about Christ. And tell me about His law. And let's not jump to another extreme on all of this and say, finally we found a preacher who tells us we don't need to keep the law. Enough of that as well. Let's get preaching that honors the law, but also honors God and honors our neighbors, and we're doing it all. And we're balanced in all of this. Don't tell me any of this. As we sit around and we say that our neighbors are in sin while we honor the law, but then we're also the ones at fault. And don't do the inverted thing either. Let's honor the law. Let's honor God. And maybe we'll get it right when we read Matthew 22, 37 through 40, and he says this, two things hang on all of this, hang the law and the prophets, and that is to love God and love your neighbor. Folks, if we do both of those things, we'll get it right. We'll get the law right. We'll get it right with our neighbors. We'll get it right with God. And that's what's important. Number 4, we have to be open and honest. One more thing after this. But look at verse 22. It says this. They said, the Jews had agreed already that if any man did confess that he was Christ, he'd be put out of the synagogue. Isn't that lousy? Isn't that lousy? Even if he is the Christ, they say, don't accept it. Folks, we've got to be open and honest with data. And then the 5th thing, and I was talking about this a little bit earlier, and that is this, that Isaiah had a task. Christ came and identified Himself in that text and said, I am the suffering servant. I'll fulfill that task, and you're going to be linked in with me. How about that, Drew? Come join in the mission and message. You're going to spread the gospel as well. And then I think about, if Christ was able to do that, what does that mean that extends to you and me? I've already talked about the John passages, so I won't bring those up again, but look at 2 Corinthians 3:18 and 2 Corinthians 4:6, and we'll close with this. This is 2 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 18. And as Paul brings to a close this very, very, very thorny text on the law and the Spirit and how it, you get all that. You know 3 of Corinthians, so I won't go through any more of that. This is 3:18. But we all, Christians, even you, even me, with open face, beholding as in a glass the glory of the Lord. You see, Moses had something on his face. The text says that it was the glory of the Lord. Exodus 34, 2 Corinthians 3. It says now, Paul says to the church, we, even we, saints, with open face, beholding as in a glass the glory of the Lord. Now the Christ's face and His glory is resting upon you and me, folks. He says it this way, we're changed from our worldly, pitiful image from glory to glory, even as by the Spirit of the Lord. Paul says we're to be transformed. And folks, that's what New Testament Christianity is about. It's about changing lives, transforming lives. And he says this in 4:6 as he closes that unit. He says this in 4:6. For the same God, the one back in Genesis 1 who said, let there be light, that same God that commanded the light to shine out of darkness, well, He's done it again. This time He's shining in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. You want to know where the glory of the Lord's supposed to rest, folks? On the faces of people like you and me. Let me tell you about a man. Well, I should probably tell you this before we close. I think Helen Keller had a really good point when she said it this way. Helen Keller, she said it this way. She said, the only thing worse than being able not to see is being able to see and having no vision. And I think as we bring all of this to a close and we realize that there's a dark and a dying and a blind world, I want to tell you the story about a man I heard in New York City who was sitting off the side of the pub, and every night he'd pull out this cigar and he'd give himself a light and sit there and watch the passersby late into the evening as people would walk back and forth. And it was dimly lit in this alley. But he'd sit there and watch this night after night. And he started to pick up on the fact that there was this blind man that would start walking by every night about the same time. And the street was somewhat busy and dimly lit. And every once in a while, this blind man would be walking along with his stick. And somebody, not realizing this man's blind, would nudge him or jar him a little bit. And one night it reached the worst of the worst when this man got knocked down, lost his stick, was fumbling around for it and trying to find his stick when people walked by, and he took a knee to the face, took a couple of bruises from it, and took a couple of days just to recover. It was a rough night. So a couple of nights passed as this man sitting outside the pub with a cigar started picking up on what's going on. The blind man's getting trampled upon. And so finally Finally, the man grabs a hold of the blind man one night and whispers something to his ear. And next thing you know, the man with the cigar pulls out another match, and instead of lighting up a second cigar, pulls open this lantern, lights the flame, strikes the match, and puts it into the bottom. And the man takes off, the blind man takes off, one hand holding the lantern, the other hand holding this stick. And he walks about and goes untouched. This happens night after night after night, until finally some scoundrels catch on to this blind man's carrying a lantern. What's up with this? And one of them yells somewhat degradingly, "Hey, blind man, don't you know that you're blind? What good's the lantern?" And he said this, "The lantern's not for me. It's for you, because you thought you could see me, and you've just found out that I'm blind. In a dark and dying world where people can't see, be the guy who lights the match."